Okay, ich fange mal an. Da scheint es so ein paar technische Fragen zu geben. Zunächst herzlich willkommen, liebe Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev. Liebe Gäste, liebe Studierende, liebe Lehrende, liebe Vertreter der Presse, ich freue mich, dass Sie heute Abend alle hergefunden haben. Wir hatten ja eine leichte Terminverschiebung. Eine richtige Schuldzuweisung können wir nicht finden, außer Fluggesellschaften dafür verantwortlich zu machen. Aber umso mehr freue ich mich, dass Sie heute Abend wieder alle hergefunden haben. Ich würde gerne mit einer Frage beginnen, die je nach Lesart harmlos oder unverschämt klingen mag. Sie lautet: Finden wir noch die Kraft zu einer alles strukturierenden These? Sind wir noch in der Lage, die Vielfalt künstlerischer Formen, Experimente und Aussagen in einer Perspektive zu ordnen, die diese Vielfalt ebenso versammelt wie in ihrer Heterogenität hervortreten lässt? Meine Damen und Herren, ganz unstrittig ist die dOCUMENTA, deren aktuelle Leiterin wir heute mit Ihnen, Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev, begrüßen, die wahrscheinlich wichtigste künstlerische Großausstellung der Welt. Alle 5 Jahre werden von ihr maßgebende Impulse erwartet. Damit ist weniger gemeint, dass in Kassel junge Künstlerinnen und Künstler entdeckt würden, die von hier aus in den Olymp der Kunstgötter aufsteigen dürfen. Gemeint ist vielmehr die Erwartung, das jeweilige kuratorische Konzept könne der Kunstvielfalt eine Struktur verleihen und sie zu einem Gesamtkonzept verdichten. An solchen Versuchen hat es in den vergangenen Jahren ja nicht gefehlt. Wir erinnern uns an die dOCUMENTA 12, deren Leitmotiv Roger Bürgel 2007 in 3 Fragen zusammenführte. Ist die Moderne unsere Antike? Was ist das bloße Leben? Und nicht zuletzt mit Lenin, was tun? Oder wir denken an die dOCUMENTA 11, in deren Umfeld Okwuer Nwesor nach der Demokratie als unvollendeten Prozess fragte, Rechtssysteme im Wandel untersuchte oder die Kreolisierung zum Thema machte. Und, um auch daran zu erinnern, 1997 rückte Katrin David politische und gesellschaftliche Themen in den Vordergrund, um den Prozessen der sogenannten Globalisierung Rechnung zu tragen. Offenbar stand damals der stark theoretische Diskurs im Zentrum eines sogenannten kuratorischen Plans. Behauptungen dieser Art mögen geeignet gewesen sein, nicht nur die Ausstellung, sondern auch die Wahrnehmung des Publikums zu ordnen. Auch lieferten sie nicht zuletzt den Medien einen Leitfaden für ihre Berichterstattung und haben dem Ergebnis damit einen strukturierten Resonanzraum in der Öffentlichkeit verschafft. Unübersehbar ist jedoch auch die Gefahr, die von einer solchen kuratorischen Ordnungspolitik ausgeht. Das Konzept droht, die künstlerischen Projekte zu überlagern. Unvermeidbar rückt es den Leiter oder die Leiterin an den Platz eines Gesamtkünstlers, der sich der Kunst nur noch wie eines Rohstoffs bedient, aus dem er oder sie dann eine These formuliert oder formt. Vielleicht irre ich mich ja, doch habe ich den Eindruck, dass Sie, Frau Christov-Bakargiev, diese Gefahr registriert und daraus einige Schlussfolgerungen gezogen haben. Wer Ihre bisherigen Aussagen aufmerksam zur Kenntnis genommen hat, wird wissen, wie sehr Sie einer kuratorischen Überformung künstlerischer Aussagen misstrauen. Und vielleicht ist es nicht übertrieben, wenn Sie, wie Sie selber sagen, Ihr Konzept darin besteht, kein Konzept zu haben. Wird man dies eine Strategie nennen dürfen? Und ist das geeignet, die dOCUMENTA 13 einer geschmeidigen öffentlichen Aneignung zu entziehen? oder mediale Vereinfachungen ins Leere laufen zu lassen und damit einer Simplifizierung Widerstand entgegenzusetzen? Sollte ein solches Nicht-Konzept tatsächlich beabsichtigt sein, so ist es vielleicht geeignet, gängige Erwartungen des Publikums zu durchkreuzen. Beispielsweise unterläuft es die Forderung, aktuellste Fragen der Gegenwart aufzugreifen, zu präzisieren und in einer Ausstellung zu zentralisieren. Oder das Postulat, die Documenta könne die zentralen Probleme unserer Zeit und unseres Seins in 100 Tagen, wie in einer Momentaufnahme, abarbeiten oder gar erklären. Das Ausbleiben eines Konzepts könnte all diesen Dogmen den Boden entziehen. Und um es zuzuspitzen, es könnte die tiefe Erschöpfung hervortreten lassen, die mittlerweile alle Dogmen, alle prinzipiellen und fundamentalen Thesen erfasst zu haben scheint. Deshalb fragte ich zu Anfang, ob wir noch die Kraft zu einer alles strukturierenden These finden. Ein Nicht-Konzept, das ich zumindest zum Teil in Ihren Äußerungen erkenne, gibt darauf eine Antwort. Nein, so scheint die Antwort zu lauten, wir haben nicht nur die Kraft zu einer derartigen These eingebüßt, mehr noch. Wir sind geradezu verpflichtet, von einer Ordnungspolitik Abstand zu nehmen, die aus solchen Thesen immer neu hervorgeht. Der Text, den Sie als Grundlage eines Gesprächs mit Studierenden, eigentlich mit vielen Studierenden auch an anderen Hochschulen auswählten, bestärkt mich in dieser Lesart. Der spätantike Skeptizismus eines Sextus Empiricus, dessen pyrrhonische Skepsis setzt an die Stelle gesicherten Wissens die Relativität der Erscheinungen, an die Stelle eines metaphysischen Subjekts das Empirische, das wechselnden Zufällen und Umständen ausgesetzt ist. Nun will ich hier nicht in eine philosophische Auseinandersetzung eintreten und fühle mich dazu auch nicht in der Lage. Doch liegt die Frage nahe, ob Sie tatsächlich der Auffassung sind, unsere heutige Situation weise Parallelen zur zerfallenden Antike auf. Auch könnte man problematisieren, ob eine Ethik der Ataraxie, also einer Unberührbarkeit und vollendeten Seelenruhe, wie sie von Sextus Empiricus im 2. Jahrhundert nach Christus formuliert wurde, tatsächlich zum Kernbestand einer postmodernen Tugendlehre zählen sollte. Eine Ausstellung, die Documenta, kehrt nicht ins Innere vollendeter Seelenruhe ein. Sie ist Ausstellung, also Exposition. Sie exponiert sich, tritt ins Außen einer Welt, um hier Wirkung zu zeigen. Und deshalb möchte ich abschließend meine wenigen Notizen zu Fragen an Sie, Frau Christov-Bakargiev, zuspitzen, die mir zugekommen sind, nachdem ich mich doch ein bisschen mit Ihrer bisherigen Äußerungen beschäftigt habe. Wird die Documenta 13 zu einem Dokument der Relativierung, der Verunsicherung und Orientierungslosigkeit? Wird sie uns in der Erkenntnis einer gescheiterten oder gar niedergehenden Moderne zurücklassen? Wird sie gar moralisch werden? Oder kann sie ganz im Gegenteil ein revolutionäres Potenzial entfalten? Und zugleich müssen wir den Inspirationen eines Sextus Empiricus folgend gegenüber der Documenta selbst große Skepsis an den Tag legen? Liebe Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev, nochmals ganz herzlich willkommen in Hamburg. Wir sind sehr gespannt auf Ihre Ausführungen. Ich bin mir auch sicher, dass Sie auf meine Fragen nicht direkt antworten werden, aber umso neugieriger sind wir, glaube ich, alle, was Sie uns über die kommende Documenta zu erzählen haben. Herzlich willkommen, a very warm welcome, Carolyn.
Ah, hello. Hallo. Ein kleines Problem. So, die erste Dinge ist danke, danke Martin Köttering für die Introduktion und Entschuldigung, weil ich muss sprechen in Englisch oder Italienisch, weil mein Deutsch ist nicht so gut, aber ich hoffe, dass nächstes Jahr vielleicht für die Dokumentenöffnung kann ich sprechen an Sie in Deutsch. Okay. So the lecture this evening is not really about the documenta, but I don't think that's a problem because it is somehow related to the documenta. Before I begin the lecture, I would like to just mention something concerning Sextus Empiricus and skepticism, which is not the topic of this evening. But it's important to remember that skepsis does not mean skeptical in the sense that it does not mean to doubt. It actually means to research, to search. So a skeptic is someone who searches, not someone who believes they do not find. If you believe you do not find, you are not a skeptic, you are an academic, according to Sextus Empiricus. And the point of a skepsis and research is to reach epoche by pitting one form of truth, which is absolutely valid, together and against other forms of truth, which are absolutely valid and provable, in order to arrive at a moment of ataraxia in Greek, which means a sort of peace of mind. So in a search for a sort of peace of mind, one constantly fails in the utmost rigorous research. And that is the practice of a skeptic. So this evening I'm going to speak to you about three things. The first point is a short statement about Documenta 13. The second point is an introduction to the notebook, to the 100 Gedanken, 100 Notizen projects, which are here on the table and which are in the bookshops already and readable and also downloadable. And then to speak about the next upcoming notebook, the new notebook that I'm working on now, and which will be coming out in about a month before Christmas. So point one, Documenta is dedicated to artistic research and forms of imagination that explore matter, things, and embodiment, an active life, Pace Hannah Arendt, of course, in connection with, yet not subordinated to, ideas. These are terrains where politics are inseparable from a sensual, energetic, and worldly alliance between current research in various scientific and artistic fields and other knowledges, both ancient and contemporary. Documenta 13 is driven by a holistic, eco-feminist, and non-logocentric vision that is shared with and that recognizes the knowledges of all the inanimate and the animate makers of the world, including people. Okay, so that was point one. Point two. So, I'd like to come and tell you this evening a little bit about a prelude to Documenta 13 in 2012, which is a project called 100 Gedanken, 100 Notizen, and which we are publishing a series of notebooks that range from a short number of pages, from the smallest is an Alexander Kluge 3-page notebook, to the longest is a 48-page notebook, and they come in 3 different sizes and many different colors. A note is a trace, a word, a drawing that all of a sudden becomes part of thinking and is transformed into an idea. This publication project follows that path, presenting the mind in a prologue state, in a state of prologue, in a pre-public arena, a space for intimacy and not yet of criticism. dOCUMENTA 13 is publishing the unpublishable, the voice, and the reader is our alibi and our ally. Note-taking encompasses witnessing. What is a witness? What is it to witness? Can one witness the moment in which one is being shot, for example, would suggest Rabbi Mroué in his research. It encompasses drawing, it encompasses writing, and a diagrammatic thinking. It is speculative, it manifests a preliminary moment, a passage, and it acts as a memory aid, for example. We take down notes of what we think we will forget, but we take down notes of what we think will be usable in the future, once we remember that we have forgotten. With contributions by authors from a range of disciplines, such as art and science, philosophy, psychology, anthropology, economic and political theory, language and literature studies, as well as poetry, so I haven't listed everything. 100 Notes, 100 Thoughts constitutes a space to explore how thinking emerges and lies at the heart of reimagining the world. In fact, Christoph Menke has done one of our notebooks. In its cumulative nature, the publication project is a continuous articulation of the emphasis of dOCUMENTA 13 on the propositional, on the notion of the propositional, underlying the flexible mental moves to generate space for the possible. Thoughts, unlike statements, are always variations, and this is the spirit of the notebook project. If one can avoid constituted knowledge, one can also avoid producing, for example, cognitive products of knowledge capitalism, for example. So it's a little bit of a choreography and exercise in the potential of not actually neither staying in the state of potentiality nor entering into the state of constituted knowledge. Both of them, one being the academic and one being the dogmatic position that a skeptic would reject. One being the, well, we'll skip one being. So this series of publications is driven by the logic of the mind at work, presenting, writing, and drawing scenarios that point outside the normative bounds of academic text production. In the form of facsimiles of existing notebooks, commissioned essays, collaborations between artists and writers, and conversations, they present models of connection making between the private and the public, between the pre-stage of intuition, the naming of ideas, and the key chain of arguments that provide the reader with a singular insight into working methods. The series is formed through interconnections. It is not arbitrary. It is a bit like a puzzle, so that the notebooks could be described as an interregnum, a temporary rupture in discursive intelligence. They do not direct us towards reason as such, but towards a different understanding of the role of consciousness. The contributors come from many fields, as I mentioned, and some of them include Etel Adnan, Kenneth Goldsmith, the founder of ubu.com website, Peter Georgi, Emily Jassir, Susan Buck-Morse, Alejandro Jodorowsky, myself, of course, William Kintridge and Peter Gallison, Erkki Kurianemi, Lars Bang-Larsen, Georgi Lukács. Yes, there's a small notebook that I found in his dusty home where no one goes, especially after 1989 in Budapest. His notes from his student period in Berlin, taking the lessons of Georg Simmel. So he's in the middle of writing down the ideas of Simmel, and on the back of the notebook, upside down, are his first thoughts on realism and the relationship between art and society that come out published quite a bit later than this notebook, for example. Paul Ryan, Irene Anastas, René Gabri, Vandana Shiva on the corporate control of life today, Gaspar Miklos Tamas, Michael Tausig, Jalal Tufik, Ian Wallace, Lawrence Weiner, and others. In this choreography of publications, we are making a choreography of presentations of the publications, for example. And that means a map of the world that is being constructed as we proceed with the various presentations. So, on April 21st of 2011, we were in Cairo, and a notebook is a rehearsal space. It allows the words, the lines, the drawings to be there before being actually there for anybody else than oneself. Thinking is not yet there, writing is not yet there, method is not yet there, and slowly all of them fall into place. The notebook is a receiver, since it is used to quickly capture our thoughts as well as the thoughts of others, and images too, like a small BlackBerry image sent from Tahrir Square. As the first public presentation of the notebooks in Cairo, it was conceived around the importance of exploring a space before a space. To reimagine public space requires the reclaiming of critical privacy, first of all, a space where we can prepare ourselves for a comprehension of what a new foundation of the public realm may entail. The notebooks, we said in Cairo, are an attempt to get closer to the point of confluence between artistic and intellectual life, inside and outside one's own world. You may remember that an artist died in the square on February 25th, and that triggered the whole collapse of also the regime. And the Egyptian pavilion in Venice was dedicated to the artist that had been killed in the square. The inside is pure potential, the outside, the possibility of its actualization. Both are needed more than ever and are articulated in a state of hope. How do we connect the minds in order to see how promises can be fulfilled? How can challenges be transformed into methods? And how can the transformations in thinking translate into a social field that is by necessity also normative? Is Cairo today the notebook for another Cairo, for a new political and cultural awareness in that region? And what, however, is the articulation between a state of hope and also a state of siege, or a state of retreat, and also a state which is that of being on a stage? And so, in New York, on May 10th, we said a notebook is a venture. It is pure speculation. Can one effectively transform thinking while thinking at the same time? The notebooks show us the hand trying to trace other logics, trying to travel a bit further away from the already known in order to cover a distance between the now and the near future. The whole series, we said, is an exercise in choreography. It creates a movement between sense and understanding. To be visible, a movement requires dramatization, and that is why these image texts do not explain, presenting us instead with affect, reality, time, matter, text, thought, space, and doubt. We apprehend a situation. It is a new situation that involves the current status of the text and art, but also that of readership, of thought, but also that of the limits of critical thinking, of life, but also that of the precarious condition of the personal and of the political, of the image, but also that of its potential for retreat, and of the singularities who decide to share their life in the form of notes. The New York presentation took its cue from all these questions: the status of the text, the interplay between raw material and finished work, between spontaneous gesture and the production of culture, between the unregulated world and the regulated systems. The notebooks addressed the existence of a third space that appears between the polarity of the creative and the constrained, a space that defies the commonsensical logic of the double versus the idealistic and possibly even the natural laws of markets versus a practice that can remain in a permanent state of surplus. And in Buenos Aires, where the first financial crisis started in 2002, in the act of writing, that was on May 19th, we said in the act of writing, it is natural to begin with a subject close to one's interests. Through writing, one also becomes aware of the fact that it is possible to compartmentalize oneself in many different ways. The problem then is not so much one of how to integrate the fragments, but of how to understand the migration of thoughts into images, into words, into forms, and intuitions into notions. It is this continuous movement from the precision and concreteness of one form of life, transmuted or imported into another, that a notebook registers. A notebook is a computing system, a third space between the utterly private and the entirely public, where infinite surveys of the self in relation to the world occur. Notes have a talent for empirical and empathic research. Using a term Jorge Luis Borges borrowed from the family of Uto-Atzecan languages used by the Hopi Indians of Mexico, notebooks constitute an ukbar, a third world, a state where the concept of subject does not matter. Here, plagiarism makes no sense, since appropriation rules and the notebook becomes atemporal and anonymous even to the writer. And in Thessaloniki, in Greece, on September 19th, we added, a notebook was a revolutionary device for the care of the self in ancient Greece. A note is not a text, it is positioned outside discourse. A note lacks the ideological dimension that is characterized by intention. Unlike the statement or the manifesto or even the essay in critical theory. Unmarked by the will to convey a message, notes are generating impulses, having a compositional function. A note begins with an affect and a sense that something is of importance. Let's say the leaden taste of collapse. Text and image, thought and text and reality, reality and a note. These oppositions insist on differences, and that is not necessary, nor is it useful. The note gleams with contradictory aspects. A note does not represent, not even thought. However, it is charged with representational effects and with realistic indications. In a time of pre-collapse, like in Greece and elsewhere today, the right to dissent from rules may be called for, as well as the need for new instruments for the construction of a relationship with oneself. As a governor manages the governed, kratia, and as a head of a household manages the household, oikonomia, the hipomnemnata, the hipomnemata, the notes, the notebooks, are personal but not intimate collections of what one could hear, see, or read. The writing on the walls of a demonstration, for example. And this to an end which was and is the care and constitution of the self, able to recover as part of the objective world, participating in its invention. And in Paris, we said, where, by the way, Jodorowsky was participating. That's a picture of the Jodorowsky notebook with the Lawrence Weiner notebook above and some of the others. We said that the writing of a notebook is a form of therapy. What kind of writing is a note? What kind of discourse can emerge between chance and disparity? What picture of knowledge does a note construct? And what does it say about intelligence? Can notes, this relatively undifferentiated matter, renew and open possibilities for art and theory? Can a note, the embodiment of a life, the life behind the hand that wrote it, invent a form of consciousness that is prior to and irreducible to the person? Can the space, time, and writing rehearsed by the notes be a form of pre-reflexive impersonal consciousness? Following an affective structure, the note is an occasion to enact the meaning of a phenomenon in a fragmentary and incomplete manner in the moment we are thinking of it. It is a process that makes evaluation possible. It is a process that makes daydreaming possible, like when listening to a lecture about notebooks. And the unity of life and thought, one step for life and one step for thought, dancing together in a semi-form of attention. Thought could unlearn from life how to cease being a censor and how to start forgetting, measuring itself against life, under hypnosis, for example. In Oslo, we said that notes have a paradoxical character. They are neither significant nor absurd. We tend to endow the world with meaning or meaninglessness in order to find some control over it. Traditionally, theory looks at the world, but the world does not look back. Can one imagine a new language that would register our being observed by the whole realm of the non-human, a form of translation or a form of speaking with the other animate and inanimate makers of the world? Notes are capable of registering this turn. They are advocates of a form of fiction that is modest and less anthropocentric. Fictional because nothing is more fantastic than the precision of translation. A note expresses nothing but itself, and in doing so, it occupies the totality of the mind. I hope you're relaxing. The necessity of notes has nothing to do with their utility. Notes have nothing to say, but they constitute a way of speaking. And therefore, we are in October, so just a month ago, in London at the Courtauld Institute. And at the Courtauld Institute, we said, a notebook is a picture of history. No, a notebook is a picture in history. Notes are the fictions of ideas. A note is an idea that occurs in the mind as a shape and does not exist yet for the world. When it does, it changes everything, and nothing is ever the same again. True, only a small part of the world is affected at first by a note. But since a note embodies the art of the possible, the whole world could change due to a note, to a fiction. A collection of notes is written outside the realm of style, and at the same time, it constitutes an anthology or an atlas of primary sources, a necessary companion to understand the relationship between experience, images, and thoughts. Notes are mild. They always start in the middle of the middle of the middle of the middle, as Lawrence Weiner would say. A result of daydreaming and semi-consciousness instead of starting at the beginning, like the conscious writing of history or the exercise of reasoning out an argument, Patsche Gertrude Stein. A note is instead a multitudinous middle. The Notebook Project is a reflection on the state of art history. It shows the forming of thinking in an unassuming way, the awakening of a readiness in writing for propositions whose contour and arguments are still in a state of becoming. It is getting ready for a transformation of the text that will affect the thinking involved with matter, objects, life, and art, with culture today. The second part is almost over. Second part. So, I'm going to tell you now about the new notebook that I'm writing, now that you understand fully what the notebooks are about and how they function. So the new notebook is called on the destruction of art, or conflict and art, or trauma and the art of healing. I haven't made a decision yet on which is the title. One day, when I was writing the place name Kassel on my BlackBerry, my smartphone, I made a mistake, and the word was automatically corrected by the intelligent digital device into Kabul. This made me think of the conflicted relationship between the technologies of communication on the one hand and the intentionality and language on the other. In turn, that made me think about conflicts in general, that is, not just war, and then about the destruction of art that often accompanies conflict as a form of trauma. This notebook I am working on is a collage of fragments precariously held together by a sense that bodies of culture, just like the bodies of people and other animate and inanimate elements of the world, survive the knots and circumstances of history, sometimes intentionally and sometimes only by chance. It speaks of art objects and taking care of them through time. It speaks of art as a casualty and a form of collateral damage, but at the same time as something that can endure, exemplifying the possibility of survival. The word conflict comes from conflictus. Excuse me. Past participle of confligere, which joins cum, which means with, which fligere, to strike, boom, 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 boom. Thus suggesting that violence being against and connection being with are correlated. Conflict, and by extension trauma, can be looked at from the point of view of intersubjectivity, or within family ties, or within the self, or within the intermediate social nexus, or in society at large, or within our multi-species environments as an unbounded world of conflicts and non-conflicts, of being with and being against. Conflict is a sharp contrast that explodes into violence, either physically or psychologically. In English, the word first appears in the 1400s, and it indicates the struggle between opposing people. In the 1700s, when commercial interests became prevalent with the rise of the bourgeoisie, the expression conflict of interest emerges. And by the 1850s, during the Romantic subjectivist century, it started to be used on a psychological level, a psychological conflict. A conflicted person is a divided person within whom incompatible urges or impulses are hosted. In 20th century field theory, for example, a conflicted individual is attracted by two objectives that cannot simultaneously be reached. In classical psychoanalysis, we all know conflict is supposed to be an internal struggle between basic impulses, such as hunger or the need for reproduction, on the one hand, and our social and moral prerogatives on the other. It expresses itself through many psychic mechanisms, such as removal, sublimation, and transformation, where, for example, the cause of pain is removed and transformed into a neurotic symptom, or a violent and aggressive impulse is transformed into the fear of being persecuted. When we experience a state of emotional tension or pain, our impulse is naturally to remove it psychically. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, I promise we'll get closer to today, written by Freud after World War I, he notes that beyond every libidinal impulse, there is a deathly drive to release and thus eliminate tension. In the same text, however, he reflects on another theoretical problem. He notes that the soldiers who had come back from the war often relived their traumatic moments, such as the exact moment when a bomb fell near them, in their nightmares, and even when they were awake. Since this return and repetition of the traumatic event did not accord with the theory that the causes of tension and pain are removed psychically, the question of trauma remained unresolved for him. The relationship between art and conflict follows many different paths. An art object can be a terrain of contention where conflict is expressed through its symbolic or its real destruction, but it can also be a form of direct activist intervention into a conflict. Or it can be information, documentation, denunciation, a form of alternative news media. Or art can be a witness and can express trauma and catharsis on the affective level of an empathetic understanding and elaboration of pain. It is often a form of collective memorialization and mourning for the losses caused by conflict. And apparently the most disengaged politically of all the above, but maybe not, art can function as a distraction and a withdrawal from conflict within the legacy of the notion of a therapeutic role and function of art. If people, art, and artists are under siege or occupation, it may be that only this last form of withdrawn activity is possible. And I use the oxymoron withdrawn activity deliberately. These paths, of course, intersect in an innumerable number of points and overlap. There is, of course, the conflict on the level of language itself, between a tendency towards aphasia, the absence of speech, and a move towards utterance, between ourselves as animals with semiotic, embodied, gestural, and affective expressions, and our subjectivity as intellectuals and producers of institutionalized knowledge. It is often through the poetic voice that language rubs up against content in speech, where utterance becomes complicated, either censored from the outside or self-censored by the subject, interrupted by trauma. Trauma, in Latin, as well as in Greek trauma, from which the Latin derives, indicates a perforation, a wound made by a sharp object. It is related to the Indo-European root ter, which points to the notion of passing through of an object or a body. It entered into English in the 1600s, and only in the late 1800s did it assume any psychological connotation. A psychic wound, trauma as a psychic wound caused by an act of violence or an accident, or by any deeply disturbing experience that causes shock, distress, and disruption of one's life. It's often discussed in relation to psychiatry, psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and literature and film studies. For Roger Lockhurst, for example, in his book, The Trauma Question of 2008, it is a complex knot that binds together multiple strands of knowledge. Modern trauma research, by the way, that's a picture of the Fridericianum on October 22nd, 1943. Modern trauma research, which goes back to the early studies mentioned above, has increased exponentially since the 1970s, when the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was first coined by Bessel van der Kolk as a severe anxiety disorder, a sense of a biological assault on the body that interrupts the flow of one's experience to the degree where one is overwhelmed and cannot cope with the situation, shuts down emotionally, losing the capacity to engage with the environment. It is cured in a variety of ways, one of which is encouraging the patient to relive the bodily movements and the bodily feelings, the physical feelings that were experienced by the subject during the traumatic moment or traumatic events. But what if, instead of the traumatized person, we were to stop a minute and think and see things from the point of view of the apparently inanimate artwork? Instead of exploring how we express trauma through artworks, we might explore how artworks themselves become traumatized, losing their orientation, severed from their experience, severed from the experience of their environment, for example, in some exhibitions, for example, in some storage spaces, for example, on some walls, for example, in some public spaces, for example, in the minds of some people with whom they do not enter into the engagement which would constitute a non-severed experience. What would the traumatized subject think or feel if that subject were an artwork or a cultural artifact? What does an object feel when it is attacked or destroyed or ignored or misunderstood or even lost and misplaced? This reminds me of Walter Benjamin's description of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus, painted the same year, 1920, as Freud wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and which we all know and have read many times, posthumously published as the 9th of his thesis on the philosophy of history in 1955, the same year of the first Documenta. It's an extraordinary example of such thinking. So even though you have read it, I would like to read it again. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. And in a later essay of 1931, called The Destructive Character, Benjamin wrote how the destructive character sees nothing permanent. In the age of global flows of information, it's an interesting thing to read again. The destructive character sees nothing permanent. But for this very reason, he sees ways, avenues, roads everywhere. Where others encounter walls or mountains, there too he sees a way. But because he sees a way everywhere, he has to clear things from it everywhere. Not always by brute force, sometimes by the most refined force. Because he sees ways everywhere, he always stands at a crossroads, at an intersection. No moment can know what the next will bring. What exists, he reduces to rubble. Not for the sake of rubble, but for that of the way leading through it. Yet destruction is difficult to talk about. And in The Storyteller, another text from 1936, Benjamin points to a modern crisis in the ability to tell a story. I quote, "As if something that seemed unalienable to us, as if something that seemed unalienable to us, as if something that seemed unalienable to us, the securest amongst our possessions were taken from us, the ability to exchange experiences." With the First World War, he writes, a process began to become apparent, which has not halted since then. Was it not noticeable at the end of the war that men returned from the battlefield grown more silent, not richer, but poorer in communicable experience? So if Freud speaks of the neurotic repetition of trauma and PTSD speaks of an interrupted experience due to trauma, similar to Benjamin's observation above, then how can we apply these ideas to thinking from the point of view of the artwork? What do the rubble and the stones at the foot of the empty cavities in the cliff where the Bamyan Buddhas once stood, prior to their bombing and destruction in 2001, see and feel? How do they speak, and how is their speech related to ours? How does their violated materiality come to matter? And how does the example of their loss and damage help us to react to a sense of the precariousness of life, precarious lives, as Judith Butler writes? the loss and damage to a flow of persons projected onto and projected from those artworks. Traumatized artworks appear to be on a standby. They are silent, withdrawn from visibility and discourse, like the house portrayed in Virginia Woolf's story, The Waves, of 1931, abandoned by humans and waiting in a suspended time for the end of the war and the return of its inhabitants. Or, like Walid Rad's miniature shrunk retrospective of his own exhibition, where all of his previous works for over 10 years were presented more or less in a sort of boîte en valise, in a model-sized tabletop exhibition space that he has been presenting in performative guided tours since 2008 under the title Part 1, Chapter 1, Section 139, The Atlas Group, 1989-2004. Withdrawn and surpassing disaster, as Jalal Tawfiq has described in related texts. Such works are speechless, numb witnesses of conflict, traumatized subjects unable to tell their stories. Aside from the Oedipus complex, Freud didn't develop many theories around the relationship between conflict existing within the psyche of a single person and external conflict as a symptom or product of our interconnected relations. It was instead a woman called Melanie Klein, in her book Envy and Gratitude, and a little bit later a man called Jacques Lacan, who looked at conflict in a more dyadic way. She looked at it in the dyadic way of the mother-child relationship as constituent of subjectivity since birth. While at first our mother's body is felt to be the extension of our own, the moment we become aware of the separation between us, we feel loss, depression, and mourning. And this in turn can transform into a feeling of envy, which is an aggressive position towards the power that the other has over us, the power to give or withdraw their bodies from us, to give or withdraw the milk to us. Or alternatively, there can be a sense of gratitude towards the other as a provider. When envy prevails, it is because we do not accept that the existence of another person can be, and we consider it as a limitation. When gratitude prevails, a relation of creativity, dialogue, and integration is constructed through our recognition that we do not define identity alone. For there to be a conflict, both the child and the mother must exist in a state of aggression. The mother is afraid of the envious child. If she is not afraid, if she withdraws from the conflict is diffused. I'm going to skip a little bit of this because we're losing a bit. So art can suspend or it can increase conflict. For example, the traditional avant-garde idea is to increase conflict, of course, to the moment of where the revolutionary process occurs. If in the context of conflict, if the context, of conflict is ignored, if one acts as if there were no conflict, in Kabul, for example, hosme, if one acts hosme, as if it were not, if the artistic act withdraws from conflict, within the conflict, like the mother subtracting herself from the envy-aggression game and engages with the traumatized art object from the point of view of gratitude, one can enter into a form of worldly alliance. And that is where the sphere of art, which is poised on the edge of the private and of history, becomes a location in which one can experiment with experience on the edge, where the rubble lies, and can build an imaginative society where the human is not at the center of our cosmology, but only one element within an accord of many elements. Appeared in 1945 as lost object because of also as last object because of a typo in a catalog. In 1970, it reappeared with a kinetic eye under the title Motif Perpetuel, which was editioned until 1974 in Torino. But we could continue talking about the history and trajectory of this object and its various incarnations, but we look at another photograph. This is a photograph of by Lee Miller, and she shot this image of dead bodies. I'm not sure if it's one or two or more, beside a train during her visit to Dachau concentration camp on the morning of April 30th, 1945. And this is another photograph of Lee Miller in Adolf Hitler's bathtub in his Munich apartment on Prinzregentenplatz, taken during the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, that same day. At the suggestion of David Sherman, a photographer for Life magazine, who was traveling through Germany as an embedded photographer with the US troops, he proposed that she would do the same, as she had been a fashion magazine photographer for Vogue magazine. So we have a surrealist fashion photographer, Lee Miller, traveling through Germany in April 1945. They spent the morning at Dachau concentration camp. She stayed in the apartment for several nights with Sherman, who at that time was possibly her lover. And he also shot this photograph. The photograph appears to have been staged, highly staged, by Miller, and speaks to me about the role of art in relation to the world, events, or politics. However, it is a traumatized, silent photograph that also suggests the impossibility of speech after what she had seen in Dachau that morning. The same day the picture was taken, Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. On a symbolic and also a bodily level, Miller takes his place. She creates a substitution. In part, she becomes the victimizer, washing herself of his crimes. It is a mythic photograph, therefore. It's structured as a mythic photograph, as if she were attempting to cleanse humanity at large of its sins. She was aware of the fact that Hitler was interested in art and had taken painting classes. On the table to the right of the image, there is a small porcelain figure that you might notice. It is in the realist, nationalist, neoclassical style in Germany and Italy in the 1930s and early 1940s, and it was designed by Rudolf Kessbach and produced as an edition by Rosenthal in 1936 with the title Die Ausschauende. Inspired by many things, including the Venus de Milo and Renoir's La Baigneuse of 1870, the figure's arm is raised. Miller also raises her arm slightly, holding a washcloth. She may also have been thinking, therefore, of Man Ray's photograph of Merritt Oppenheim in a similar pose, with the black ink or paint staining her uplifted arm and holding a wheel, a subject trapped in the machines of modernity. If Man Ray's image was in conversation with Marcel Duchamp's La mariée mise à nu par ses célibataires même, 1915-1923, also known as the large glass, then Lee Miller's photograph here could also secretly refer to the structure of the large glass, I argue, with its bipartite universe. The small machine that you see on the table next to the sculpture would echo the broyeuse de chocolat. Hitler is himself portrayed in the upper portion of the photograph on the edge of the bathtub, clearly something which was staged by Lee Miller. A photograph that she found in the house. In what looks like a media or a press image, as if the balanced world of Duchamp had been turned upside down, with the célibataire had somehow found its way into the upper portion of the image. Could this be a proto-feminist accusation against the patriarchal military world that lay behind the image? The object on the table, the device on the table, beside the little sculpture, is probably just a device for calling servants. However, its shape alludes also to that of a camera at the time, and therefore to the device that permits the obscenity of photography's detached power over life. The obscenity of photography's detached power over life. a feeling akin to survivor syndrome that Miller may have felt in Dachau that morning with her camera. Indeed, her dirty boots lie at the foot of the tub. The rug is dirty with the mud of the camp, and on the nearby chair, her small watch is placed on top of the clothes she presumably wore to the camp. Time has stopped. It is, however, a photo of the camps, but it is an indirect photo, without the literality of body horror. This instead is a BlackBerry image I took with Gustav Metzger. Gustav Metzger left Germany as a child in 1939 as part of the refugee children movement which brought Jewish children out of Germany to Great Britain. He never saw his mother and father again, he never returned, and he still lives in London with no passport. The image shows what is left of one of the highly colored pastel on paper drawings representing a couple making love, a couple embracing, that Metzger made between 1953 and 1957 when he took a studio in King's Lynn in East Anglia. After drafting his auto-destructive art manifesto, indeed in 1959, as we all know, he collected all of his early drawings. He didn't destroy them. All the drawings he had made since 1945 until 57, and he put them in a suitcase, and he stored them away above a garage at the home of a relative in North London. I think probably the family where he was taken as a child. And they were kept there until 2010. Most are in a relatively good state of conservation. However, this one in particular was destroyed by humidity and folding, suggesting a loop in time. How ironic that he had put away his drawings at the moment of the manifesto of autodestructive art, and that this one had been destroyed by its being put away. It also presents that paradox, conserving it and given his later work based on the repetition of the trauma of destruction as an indirect act of outrage towards a 20th century society that appeared in the late 1950s at the time of his autodestructive manifesto during the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, to be moving again towards self-destruction all over. We opened the drawings together, and I took this photograph with my BlackBerry by permission of the artist. These 3 pages are also in the notebook. 2 of them hand-numbered as pages 18 and 19, and the final one unnumbered were discovered by Chus Martinez in May 2011. I had asked her to go look through the Gustav Metzger papers at the Tate Archive in London while I was looking at his drawings for a second time at Jayhawk Storage. Never transcribed, published, nor reprinted as facsimiles before, they are the artist's notes, dated October 19th, 1959, on self-destructive art, an expression that predates the term autodestructive art, eventually chosen as the title of the famous manifesto to which they led. The manifesto was released as a leaflet 2 weeks later, November 4th, 1959, and first distributed on the occasion of his cardboards exhibition. A comparative analysis, which I cannot do this evening, because it would take hours and I think I've already gone overboard. However, a comparative analysis would, between these October notes and the November manifesto, illuminates his decision to use the term auto instead of the term self. And I will tell you only this one point. In Greek, autos means him, her, or its same, himself, the same. As a prefix, it is used to indicate an event that is caused by one's own agency, as in the term automatic, that which moves by its own impulse, and autodestructive, that which destroys itself. And it has assumed a mechanical connotation in modernity. Self is very similar. It derives from the old Germanic pronoun selbas, practically a synonym of the Greek autos, But in modern English, self developed to include the connotation of a subject having a form of reflective self-consciousness. And this may be the reason why Metzger chose not to keep the prefix self, since no reflective consciousness could commit such insane acts as those perpetrated during World War II or those that seemed to be looming in the late 1950s during the nuclear arms race. There's so many interesting points comparing the manifestos, but I'm losing the audience, so I'm just going to go right straight to the end. So here we go. It's for another lecture. Okay. The National Lebanon Museum, the National Museum of Lebanon, was founded in Beirut in 1937 and first opened in 1942. During the Lebanese Civil War of 1975-1990, it was severely damaged due to its location on the front line separating warring factions in downtown Beirut, an area known as Museum Alley that was a checkpoint controlled variously by Lebanese militias, the Syrian army, and the Israeli army. The museum endured shelling, bombing, and flooding throughout the 1980s, when the curators closed it and began to safeguard the material heritage it contained in various ways. The curators. Smaller objects were hidden and stored in the basement, which was walled up with bricks, while larger and heavier artifacts, including floor mosaics and sarcophagi, were encased first in wood and then in cement, concrete. And then they were quiet, the curators, and they waited. After the war in 1990-1991, the discovery was made that although they had done all of this to hide and protect the objects in the collection, a fire in a wing that had been shelled had destroyed documents and records, including maps and photographs, as well as 45 boxes containing archaeological objects, such as those that you see here, that had melted together. In 1999, the museum reopened and still hosts this incredible collection. On your left, item number 13630 is an object resulting from the fusion of metal, ivory, glass, and terracotta objects that happened to be near each other when the fire was raging. At this stage, it's difficult to identify with certainty from the terracotta and the ivory shards the objects that burned. It is also quite impossible to determine the shape of the glass that melted and was combined with other objects. The one on the right is a bronze object, number 28108 of the museum numbering system. It's a combination of two bronze figurines, one human and one zoomorphic, from the Byblos excavation, dating back to the Middle Bronze Age. Of course, the copper alloy is very badly damaged, but the figurines are quite identifiable. This is the cave with the rubble of the Bamyan Buddhas. This is the Western Buddha niche. After a month-long destruction, it took a month to destroy the 53-meter-high Buddha statue, which finally collapsed on March 12th, 2001, in Bamyan Valley, Afghanistan. And these are photos of some of the fragments and the rubble. These are taken by Mr. Praxenthaler in 2002, who was there with ICOMOS, Deutsches Nationalkomitee, with Michael Petzet. I'm going to skip the whole Bamyan thing. We can talk about it in Kassel. And two more pictures. This that you see here are images of Mike Rakowitz's installation called The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, Recovered, Missing, Stolen Series at the Sharjah Biennale, Sharjah Art Museum in 2007. The objects on this 5-meter-long table are made out of Middle Eastern packaging, newspapers and glue, to reproduce looted ancient Mesopotamian artifacts that were in the collection of the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, originally founded in 1926, that closed during the First Gulf War and reopened in 2000 until the catastrophe of 2003, when a tremendous looting of antiquities took place in April after the arrival of the US troops in Baghdad. The museum is supposed to reopen now in November 2011. This notebook is running out of pages, and also the lecture, and it's coming to an end. I started it with a note on silence. I spoke to you about Benjamin's notes on the storyteller. It ends with notes on silence, according to the Egyptian artist, well, Armenian artist living in Cairo today, Anna Bogigian. The following 3 images, including this one, are untitled drawings by Anna, all made during her travels in 2001, using colored crayon and pencil on 40 centimeter by 30 centimeter sheets of 200-gram sennelier paper. As is usual for her, she combines drawing and writing into a seamless story. Each is followed by a transcription of the words that she wrote down. Well, actually, I'm going to read them to you here. The notebook, they'll be followed by the transcription of the words that she wrote both as a form of drawing, of note-taking, of writing, of listening to silence that becomes a form of seeing. So I will help you read them. So you can, I can read with you. First line, in the words that I collected and put away in my thoughts were systems of reasoning or dialects, thinking, methods, relation, times. Words described who I am or who I transmit to be through the sound system. I build images of cities unique to that particular city that I dream of or remember in the depth of my mind. The sounds of a city, the song of a crow makes India to me. Yet the crow is everywhere in each country I visit. But the way the crows sing in India is particular to that peninsula. From ear to eye, from ear to they, ear dropped into all my thoughts, my words and actions, they wove a story that made out of me a criminal. But what was the crime, political, social, or religious, or altogether? A fabrication. I threatened something somewhere to the established systems of politics. That power that controls the system or everybody. Life, I couldn't throw stones to the existing system, as I cannot say I do not have my own sins, but neither can I relate to the woven story of my existence. The word created my mind, images took meaning, stories is, woven through the words that I have. The passage from the outer ear to the land of my inner ear formulates a given description of a set of action lived. Through hearing, I created or met the world by where my inner self and created descriptions of the world within my mind. I stored the information necessary in my luggage, the luggage that I was born with. The words I heard expressed or explained to me what the world is about, and when I created stories in my mind, I used those vocabulary that was given to me. In a world of silence, there is no words, no singing of birds or traffic noise. It is the silence of lack of hearing, different from silence, the silence of infinity. That's it.
Yeah, so thank you very much. We have time for some questions. Actually, I'm not really sure if I am more curious now or more confused for the Documenta 13. But I got at least two central words, notes and conflict. And maybe the audience can give me some notes and produce some conflicts. There are at least one microphone running around. So, do we have some questions? So, then maybe I start with another question.
Why?
No, actually, I mean, maybe one of the most important questions is, and I promise I would be very angry if somebody tries to ask you for names from artists. I think that is really, in a way, a stupid question, because it's not?
It's okay, but I won't answer.
But you won't answer. You take this microphone?
Okay. No, it's a logical question.
Yeah. No, but maybe I come with one question back to the notes.
Yes.
I couldn't really get the point, the relation from notes to the exhibition, to the works, or to the what artists will show, or what you will show with artists in the documenta, during the documenta. Are the notes, these brilliant notes, is it a kind of preparing the audience, the people, to the documenta, or is it already the documenta? Is it just one part to get the perspective maybe different? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, I think it's both. Certainly, there is nothing necessarily in common between all the notebooks. So you cannot see a theme, but there is nothing in contradiction between any of them. So in a way, they are like an ideal community, in a way, of how you what it is to think with, to make with others. So you could say that there is nothing necessarily in common between all the participants of the documenta, but there is nothing in contradiction. So that is a position. That is a position. Certainly many of the questions that are addressed in the notebooks are also addressed variously by different artists. That's true. For example, the question of, Andrew Ross's notebook, or many of the notebooks actually, I think, emerge out of trying to imagine ways of reacting or acting within knowledge capitalism, I think. So that is a subject, for sure, of the work of a number of artists. Others have to do with questions of multi-species coevolution, like Donna Haraway's. And indeed, I think that's a very important question that's addressed in some of the works by artists in the documenta. Others are like Vandana's, you mentioned. Vandana's is about the corporate control of life and coming into everything. And so that is a subject that's also dealt with by some of the artists. But I prefer not to speak about subject matter. I think I prefer to speak in terms of the procedures through which the documenta grows. So the relationship between how one text may generate also the other texts. So it would have been easy to pick 100 authors and invite them and then make a book, even 100 notebooks that come out all at once with different positions. But by having them come out as a catena, as a chain, many authors are reading the ones of the preceding chain. So it's more in the form of a conversation than in the form of a commission of 100 essays or 100 lectures, for example. But of course, I think about Catherine's, my only woman predecessor. Amazing. I doubled the statistics. It's amazing. But I think about her 100 days, 100 talks, you know, they're in the background. But the idea is how you can have 100 people listen to 100 talks and give talks, having listened to the talks of the others. It's very difficult. You would have to have 100 people in the same room for 100 days, and you can't do that. So how does one break this molecular situation of separation into specific knowledges that is now so characteristic of our time. So that's a procedural question that I think you will see also in the so-called exhibition part. You know, I don't even like the word exhibition, by the way. No.
Well, what is another word? Show.
Apparition. Yeah, because exhibire, you know, is to put out. So yeah, that's just as interesting as inhibition, to keep in. It's not more interesting to put out than to keep in. So I would eliminate both ex and in and maybe go towards apparition. I think it's a more humble kind of notion of something coming into the world and being seen or not seen, but not imposing itself on as a form of visibility. That doesn't answer your question, but I hope it does. So the simple answer is yes, everything here is connected to artworks by artists. Some of the artists are also participating in the series. So if you look at the artists who are doing notebooks, it would be logical to presume that they are also in the documenta. Although it's not a given, but it would be logical. Does that answer your question?
So far.
I learn from the artists, basically.
Yes, I have a sort of question, or maybe more like a comment. I think you showed tonight quite a lot of like material besides from the notebooks. It's sometimes like small sculptures where it's like what do you call it in English? Ballung, like it's like pressed together. And I was thinking about what character does this material get? And how is this connected to the topic of trauma and body in this material? Is it where does your concept of material come from?
Well, it comes from many things. It comes from Karen Barad, Why Matter Matters, for example. I mean, the simple answer would be that we live in an advanced digital age of over-virtualization and a sense of, I mean, if you look at it sociologically, there are many increases in forms of anxiety, there's increases in anorexia in young women, there's a certain number of effects of spending a lot of time wired, for example. There's, for example, a decrease in the ability to interpret facial expression. So there are many things that need to be counterbalanced in ways. So embodiment can be done in many ways. For example, you can learn from dogs how to interpret facial expression, and maybe they haven't lost that as much as humans in the urban environment have lost the ability, simply because we spend less time looking at another person's face and training and exercising the learning of facial expression. So there are so many aspects to the advanced digital age and the consequences, in neurological consequences in terms of perception. And so training, or some forms of training in embodiment and in materiality, and why matter matters and not just language matters, is logical, I think, today. But it's not me, you know, I am not having a theory and then applying it. It comes from the world itself. For example, the incredible increase in interest towards ceramics. You know, what does that mean? What does that mean? The question of durability, the question of something that's transformed and that doesn't transform backwards. You can't undo, you know, like on your computer. You can't undo a ceramic. Once it's cooked, it's cooked. So the metaphors, but not just the metaphors, the meaning behind certain techniques of dealing with materials today have a philosophical weight and have an existential weight that I think matter for a lot of people now. Stones matter, weight matters. Not in antagonism. You know, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, for example, the anthropologist from Brazil, his book, The Turn of the Native, he speaks about this alliance between the most ancient knowledges and the most advanced knowledges that are often present in remote indigenous communities, which I experienced a lot of, for example, during my time in Sydney, when I was director of the Australian Biennale, the Sydney Biennale. For some years I was very much there and spent a lot of time in remote communities, and one of the amazing things was to find people who, you know, are not interested, communities where the number of dogs and the number of people are more or less equal, which is, and no chairs, no interest in chairs, but an incredible use of smartphones or laptops, and knowing how to fix your laptop and to take apart an iPhone and fix it, you know, something that very few people in Hamburg would know how to do. And simply because it's a lot easier to learn how to fix it and do it, rather than send it all the way to Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne and get it back after 3 weeks. So this, you know, knowing how to make fire and from scratch without matches, and knowing how to make a BBS, you know, an alternative kind of internet connection, is not alternative, autonomous, let's say, is our skills that, for example, Eduardo Viveros de Castro writes as being the skills that are the most useful for the upcoming years, in the next century, for example. So I don't know if that answered your question, but my interest in why matter matters has to do, it comes from many sources, from anthropology, contemporary anthropology like Tausig and Eduardo Viveros is a very important figure, from many different fields, feminism like Karen Barad and Dana Haraway, from many different fields. It's not only about that, though. I answered very sociologically. I think there's something about intensity right now and focus, you know. So in cognitive capitalism, people speak a lot and people talk a lot, and they transform into bits and language. They transform knowledge, and it's a disease also in the art world. It's a disease, but very few people coming out, for example, of the best art schools, I mean as curators and intellectuals and theory people in theory, very few of them actually know, you know, the different kinds of paper, the effects of ink on a different kind of paper. And if you don't know the materiality of things, there's a kind of detached knowledge where the mind and the spirit are seen as separate, and that's ridiculous. In the age of quantum physics, it's crazy to think that the mind and matter are separate. They are exactly the same elements on subatomic level. It's continuous. There's no discontinuity at all, or you can't build a quantum computer. I mean, a quantum computer is based on photon entanglement, and you can't, if you don't understand that, you have this idea that there's theory here and then there's matter there. It's ridiculous. I mean, any good physicist would tell you it's ridiculous.
Yeah, your answer is, again, a new lecture. It's quite interesting, but maybe one more question. Yeah.
You spoke about the notebooks as an ideal community. I would ask you about communication. Why did you change your communication team twice?
Oh, that's an interesting question. First of all, it's not I, you know, it's a we. I really thank the people that I worked with from the beginning. Each person that I worked with brought incredible resources and knowledges, and so I publicly here acknowledge all of those people for their contribution. So it's not an I mean, there's no, you know, dictator in the office saying goodbye, you know, it's not like that. It's more like the relationship between two people who decide to not continue to be together. So it's a mutual relation, it's a mutual decision. That didn't answer it. That's a little bit like, you might think that that's a diplomatic answer. You might think, but it really isn't a diplomatic answer. I also had a first husband. He's not my husband now, and I greatly admire him. He was a mathematician, and I love him dearly. And in that phase of my life, it was the right man to be with. After, it was not. So, why? You probably ask for more answers to that. There's another answer, which is, if you look in the history of Documenta, the relationship between the communication department and the curatorial department has always been rather complicated. So it's not only my story, it's really the story of Documenta generally. Why might have something to do with the fact that there's two opposite impulses. You know, the one impulse is to give as much information, and the other impulse is to protect the artists and the makers of the Documenta, to leave them a little bit in peace. So if everyone had the list of the artists who have almost 100% been invited already since 6 months, you know, and many since 2 years ago, there are people who have been working for 2.5 years on their project already. If everybody knew who they were, they would not be in a protected position, because they would be, there would be a lot of speculation around them and around their work, and they would be getting hundreds of invitations to other exhibitions, and it just creates an environment which is not an environment that is good for research. And I believe that art is a form of research. So you have to, Documenta has a huge visibility, and therefore you have to somehow protect the people and allow them to think and try and change their projects and decide one day they're going to do, you know, a rocket going to Mars, and the next day they're going to do a lake somewhere else. After 6 months they can change completely. Or you can also decide to do a poem instead. So it's a way of protecting, I think, the artists and the people who are making the Documenta. Documenta has a strange time. The time of Documenta is not actuel. It's supremely inactuel, as, who said that? To be supremely inactuel. It's not Adorno? I don't know. Maybe Adorno. Anyway, I looked at my head of education, so I might have to change that. No, absolutely. Maybe education is one of the pillars. I hope someone asks a question about maybe education. Vielleicht Vermittlung. So the time of Documenta is very slow compared to the biennales or the rhythm of contemporary life right now. 5 years between one and another is incredible. There are art movements can emerge and submerge within that time. You know, it's so much can happen. So that the Documenta time is a little bit kind of different from the speed of our society of communication. That makes it complex. It makes it complex. And then I think we should be allowed to kind of play with signs. You know, I believe in playing with signs. Like, there are many little puzzles that appear. If you open these notebooks and you take these pictures, you can combine them, this picture, you can combine with this picture, you know, and it becomes a building. And nobody has noticed that. But at the end, maybe somebody will notice. And these are little, so there's a way that I'm trying to create a past in the future. So when the future occurs, when 2012 occurs, a certain number of elements will seem obvious and logical, and they come together like a puzzle. So this is a way of buying time and creating the experience of recognition. So the experience of recognition is an incredibly empowering experience for people to recognize something that they have already seen. It's beautiful experience. That's why I'm always involved in ideas like repetition and revolution as being connected, very connected. It's a question of seeing what one has already seen. So to do that, you have to create a structure to get to that point. Now, you probably wanted a simpler answer. But
I think it's all right.
Yeah, there is no simple answer. There is no simple answer. I'm really grateful. No, there can't be.
So,
but I'm really grateful. Everyone who has been 1 year with me has, you know, I might have decided it right from the start, for all you know, that it could have been a plan, you know, that 1 year it's this person, next year it's that person, next year it's that person, and then all together they appear at the opening. Who knows? Maybe.
Okay, maybe one last question, and it could be a very short answer. Yes, it's just a question. Do you like Kassel? I mean, nobody is here from Kassel, and I know. Oh, there is somebody from Kassel. Okay, but I know that quite a lot of, I think, the Documenta chefs were in a kind of fighting with the city, fighting with the history of the city. So is it for you, is it a theme, or is it just Kassel is all right?
Huh.
That's fine.
Well, you know, you obviously, I mean, I don't know, I can't speak for the past, so I don't know. I really don't know the situation of the past. Catherine was French. And so, elle est très précise. Il faut être absolument moderne et il faut être absolument précis. I am half Bulgarian, half Italian, with 2 passports, an American passport and an Italian passport, with possibility of having a Bulgarian passport. So it's a very different kind of apolide person. I've lived in many different parts of the world. So I land in Kassel as I land in Sydney, as I landed in New York, as I land in Torino, I don't feel totally belonging anywhere, nor totally uprooted anywhere. I really was impressed by seeing Kassel when I was nominated, because I had only been to Kassel during Documenta opening week in the past, before that, since 1987. And Documenta opening week is, you know, it's the center of the world. There's like, it's so full you can't walk down the sidewalk. So I never saw Kassel before. So the biggest surprise was to see Kassel without Documenta. And I discovered many things which I hadn't seen, like, for example, the Hochheisel fountain. The Hochheisel fountain is fantastic. Do you know this fountain? Yeah, it's fantastic. It's an underground fountain in the shape of the Aschrottbrunnen that was destroyed in the late 30s. And I had walked by that place hundreds of times in the Documenta opening weeks and never noticed that it was there, this monument to the absent fountain. So Kassel has been a discovery of so many things like that, so many layers of its history. The Huguenot part I didn't know, very interesting. The Brothers Grimm, of course I knew, but to learn that the Brothers Grimm had incredible collections of stories from all over the world. They had amazing collections from Indian stories and so on. So it took away a kind of cliché view that I had of the Brothers Grimm, and it's amazing. I mean, Kassel is actually extraordinary. It has one of the most important books in the history of alchemy. It's in Kassel, and it's the most important, maybe in the world, book. And then it has an incredible collection of scientific devices in the Orangerie, 2 instruments for mapping time and space. This is amazing. Maybe the second most important collection in the world, if not the first at this point, because in terms of or so my advisor, Anton Zellinger, speaking about quantum physicists, tells me, you know, when we visited it together, the incredible quality of that collection is amazing. Of course, I discovered that it is a city that builds tanks still today, and it's shocking. I mean, the fact that, but so many places, what I mean is, it's like a microcosm of the world. And so I think it's really quite amazing. The whole region is quite amazing. But you see, I find everything amazing. No really, I do. I think the world is amazing. No, I think the world is absolutely amazing.
Okay, I think next time I will see Kassel, it's hopefully with Documenta.
I'll take you on a tour.
Yes, I like to have that. But for tonight, thanks very much for coming. There are two possibilities now. Vielleicht jetzt switche ich zurück wieder auf Deutsch. Also es gibt hier noch ein bisschen was zu trinken. Oben im zweiten Stock in der HFBK-Galerie gibt es gerade eine Ausstellung mit Studierenden von Corinne Wasmuth, die von Studierenden der HFBK eingeladen worden sind. Auch da kann man noch einen Blick reinwerfen. Und ich glaube, Carolyn, Christov-Bakargiev wird jetzt auch noch ein bisschen hier sein. Smalltalk, einen Drink haben und nochmal ganz vielen herzlichen Dank fürs Kommen. Danke.